Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode was recorded at the Regent Street Cinema in London after a screening of the South Park movie, South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. I'm talking to the one-time film director and now campaigner against the power of big tech companies, Beeban Kidron, about what makes this film so funny, what makes it so shocking, but also what makes it prophetic. As always with these film episodes, we're very aware that the conversation you're about to hear is in front of an audience who have just seen the movie, and you probably, almost certainly, haven't. So I normally do a little summary here of what the film's about, tell you the plot, among other things. It's a little tricky for this one, not least because I don't think the plot is the point. And if people listening have never seen South Park, let alone the South Park movie, it's going to be quite hard to convey what it's like. This is the film based on the very long-running animation series South Park, which for people who don't know is set in a fictional town, South Park. I think it's in Colorado, and in an elementary school with a group of, I think they're third graders, young boys called Stan, Kyle, Eric, aka Cartman, and Kenny. And it is vicious adult satire put into the mouths of children. That's the point. In this, the film-length version, which was made in 1999, so fairly early in the South Park story, South Park is still running. The plot revolves around a fictional film inside the film, made by two imagined Canadian comedians, I guess they're comedians, called Terence and Philip. The film is called Asses of Fire, and it's basically fart jokes and profanity. The kids go and see it and start swearing, as we say in Britain, like troopers, and it creates a kind of moral panic among their moms. And part of the joke of the film is it is a satire of the moral panic created by South Park. Particularly Kyle's mom wants to take the fight to Terence and Philip, which means taking the fight to the Canadians, and the result is war. War between the United States, then under the presidency of Bill Clinton, and Canada. It's quite hard to say what happens after that. It's chaos. The Baldwins get killed as collateral damage, as I think also do the Arquettes. There's also another subplot of a kind. Saddam Hussein in this movie, who was still alive back then, is portrayed in hell, where he has entered into a sexual relationship with Satan. Satan and Saddam conclude that when Terence and Philip are executed, their reign will begin on earth. They will become the overlords and the masters of all they survey. So part of the point of the film is to watch Satan and Saddam return from the underworld and to see what fate awaits them. The style, the animation style of South Park is famously simple. The film also contains a number of songs which are parodies of musical theatre. One of the songs, which is about the US-Canada war, is clearly a parody of One Day More from Les Miserables. Various real-life figures, not just Saddam, feature in the film. Bill Clinton is there. Bill Gates is there. He gets a bullet in the head. Conan O'Brien falls off a high building. That's the kind of film it is. We are taking it seriously because, as you will hear in this conversation, in the midst of all the fart jokes, all of the swearing, all of the childish humour, there is something serious and seriously far-sighted in what this film is trying to say about technology and censorship. So I'm really curious to know, and maybe people could tell us about this when we get to the questions. I don't know how many people have never seen that film before, but I'd love to hear from people who had never seen it before, because one of the questions about it is whether it is still shocking. I think it was shocking if you read about critics' reactions. It came out in 1999, which is a long time ago. Not everyone was shocked by it, but some people genuinely were. Do you find it shocking now?
It's very hard to still be shocked by it because, I saw it before and it's been around a long time. And also, do you know what? I find it nostalgic more than shocking.
Quaint.
I do. I find it quaint. I mean, I was howling with laughter through it, but I think what is most shocking is how little things have changed, how much we concentrate on the words, how little we concentrate on what's happening in the background. You can have a war, but you get upset because someone's said fuck in a tweet, maybe. So I think that what is shocking is how little we've learned rather than the film itself.
And yet, my guess is that when they made it, if you'd said to them in 2026, what will be so funny about this film is that the President of the United States will be the one saying fuck in a tweet. And there will be a serious debate taking place, which has happened in the last month,
Yeah.
as to which of the two truths, as they're called, truth social messages, was the more shocking. The one in which the President of the United States said, open the fucking straight, Fuckin, crucially, apostrophe, not with the G, or the one in which he said, a civilization will die tonight. And there has been a genuine argument. I've read articles saying of those two, the one that we should be really horrified by is the first one. Because when the President of the United States uses a word like that, we're all going to die. And of course, the president using it does make it a bit different, but it is surreal almost that the argument is still happening now. But the president is the one doing both things. Bill Clinton in that movie, they didn't go so far as to have Bill Clinton saying the words.
No, but they did make him irrelevant, which was very funny. I think, seriously, I think you have to say really clearly the president wanting to take out a whole civilization is the more important thing. Should we just get that on the record? I think that the fact that he had the sort of discipline to leave off the G was also very interesting because he's actually telling us that he's doing this deliberately. But I think the fact that we are so distracted by language is what the film is about. And I think where the worlds collide for me is here we've got a film and a whole industry of South Park that just takes something, puts it to its essential part, makes it satirical, goes harder and harder than you think until you're laughing and you're ashamed and you're appalled all at the same time that you're laughing. And actually, the president looks like he'd fit right in. So I think that's what's shocking is the colliding of these two worlds where politics has actually become like entertainment and we actually consume it a bit like entertainment. What has he done this morning? What did he overnight? Have you heard the latest thing he said? So I think that that's what I find shocking is that real life has collided so completely with the vision of this movie over the last period. I find it actually quite extraordinary.
So I imagine when they made it, they thought that some of the stuff about censorship might be the forward-looking prophetic bit, but probably not the politics. The politics was just straight out, not even satire, whatever is the thing beyond satire. And when I was watching it just now, in a way, the thing that both amused me and shocked me the most is that Kyle's mom is Pete Hegseth. I mean, genuinely, it's quite an uncanny portrayal. When Clinton introduces his new Secretary of Defense and she comes on and says Secretary of Offense, he's changed the name to Secretary of War. And then her vision of the war and how it'll be prosecuted is quite close to Hegseth's vision. And actually, they can't have known, but Mothers Against Canada, MAC, in the red, it's not a million miles from MAGA. And weirdly, this film, in the politics, I think we'll talk about the censorship because that's in a way where we're in a different world. It's a work of prophetic genius.
Well, I think it is. I mean, I do think it is. And I think that we now live in an age of denial. We live in an age of denial about language in particular. And everybody keeps on looking at the wrong piece of it. And here we have, the kids, and the devil isn't the devil. That's the other great thing about the movie. It's like, the devil's the poor sucker who can't get a break. But I think that feeling of absolute denial about everything that is happening to everybody. And I think the genius of the film, if I might say, is actually in the detail. I mean, that bit about, when the army all comes in and they're the advance guard and it's all the black soldiers. I mean, which American war has that not been true in? But actually, have you ever seen it literally like that, boldly said? And I think everywhere, from the abortion reference to the bleeding reference, every little detail, nobody was spared, but nobody went unloved. And I think that is a really interesting part of the movie. It was saying, all of this is going on in culture while you're worrying about the swearing.
And that great line, haven't you heard of the Emancipation Proclamation? I don't listen to hip hop, which brings the two together. The Saddam stuff, I don't know if it's shocking, but again, I found myself thinking, so it's 1999. Saddam is not dead yet, right? Saddam was still alive. Saddam was executed. And he was executed in a way that was weirdly quite
similar.
like the executions here. I wouldn't recommend looking it up. But Saddam's execution in 2006 was a truly shocking public spectacle. But in 1999, Saddam was alive. And I'd like to think that some of his people said, you should see this movie that they've made about you, and wondering what his reaction would be. But of course, in South Park, the movie now, Trump is often in that role, having sex with Satan. And you feel like if you showed it to Trump, it would just be water off a duck's back. This is the world that Trump lives in. In a way, the Saddam bit, it would be hard to recreate the shock of that now with Trump. I was thinking, in a way, to make it as shocking as that now, it couldn't be Trump, it couldn't be Putin, it would probably have to be Netanyahu. If you had Netanyahu in that role, it would genuinely shock, but also we wouldn't be watching it because that movie couldn't be made, which also says something about the world we're in now.
And I think there was something very interesting in the fact that Saddam was a picture of himself and not a cartoon of himself, and all the pictures on the walls about what is real and what is not real, what is made funny and what is actually represented. And I think that some of the things that it had to say about the detail, about what was real and about what you had to pay attention to, was really very sophisticated.
And some of it is musical theatre parody, some of it is cinema history parody. The politics is weirdly now, but some of the arguments about censorship, which I want to talk to you about, and about the ways in which it did or didn't foresee the way this is going, some of that feels very much of its time. So this is 1999. Clinton's America. Al Gore was vice president. At that point, what people would know about Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, was that she had, earlier in the decade, I think, led the campaign against hip hop, actually. So this is the age of parental advisory stickers on hip hop albums, trying to protect the children of America from the foul language that they particularly heard in hip hop and black music. And that now seems very 20th century relative to now. That bit, the point in the film where they more or less say the message of this film is we're fine with violence on TV, but people are outraged by hearing bad words. That feels a little dated to me. So I get your point that the themes are still there, but that version of it?
I was thinking as I was watching, I mean, my day job is, a lot of it is around online safety for kids. And I did wonder a couple of times during the movie, am I that woman? There was a sort of a tickle of anxiety about that while I was watching the film. But no, absolutely it has changed. And I think that all the arguments around speech and technology really actually are arguments about commerciality, design, pushing freedom of thought. It's not speech in the way that the tech companies would have us believe, and it's not speech in the way this movie is ridiculing this sort of obsession about bad words.
Because you get a glimpse of the two worlds colliding just at that bit where he goes online. So I can't remember 1999. I don't know exactly where we were in the arc of the internet, but he's searching for the word clitoris and he says there are 8 million sites. Well, you can get 8 million sites if you search for anything now. And then almost as an aside, they just have the joke, oh, it says you got to be 18, click. Oh, it says, are you an adult? Click. And on we go, and he sees what he sees. And you just get that glimpse of these two things, that satire of the sort of Tipper Gore version of this, what's in the mainstream media, what people can buy in a record store, what the kids are listening to in their bedrooms, and just this glimpse of the world that's to come. And they are two completely separate things.
They are. And I actually thought that moment was one of the very clear points of, seeing the future rather than describing the present, because actually a lot of people, I got involved in the whole issue around child online safety in 2012, and everybody thought I was a nutcase then. So in this moment, this is a decade earlier that people are, that they're actually beginning to talk about that issue. I think that at that point, there was no understanding that actually you might make anything different for one group of people online from another group. The whole kind of concept of the internet was all users were going to be equal. And therefore, the idea of having to announce your age was really not in the public imagination.
And it's almost as though it's glimpsing that there are these two worlds. So the world that's mainly being satirized in this film is the world in which parents and politicians think it should be possible to control speech, and they're worrying about the wrong thing. So in that version of the argument, the grown-ups are worrying about the wrong thing, and the grown-ups are hypocrites as well. And then there's just this glimpse of another world in which no one is going to be able to exercise that control. And the arguments are going to be very different because, as you say, there will be no difference between children and adults. There will be no difference between access permitted and access denied, because there is no control. So it's like a glimpse of an anarchic future of quote unquote free speech, and the familiar arguments of the late 20th century about free speech, which is about control in media that can be controlled.
Yeah, and I think then we're into a new world order where actually it's not all the same in different countries, for different ages, for different kinds of material, for different owners of material. So that idea of that particular freedom collapsed as the internet got commercialized. So it sort of leaps over an area to where we are now. But I think that it is involved in that discussion in a sense of saying, really? Is this going to work? Is this really going to work? Because if we're going to have all of these issues about what kids can access and about what people are allowed to say and what we're going to make available in this part of the world, and then we're going to have everything open here, how does that work? So I think it was raising the question, and I do think it was very early to raise the question. Then we have had a period of this embattled bit, and now, although we are still embattled about where the edges are, there is an absolute understanding that there's going to be different speech, whether that is because China, some other autocratic state, a blackout in Iran, or to do with pornography in kids in the UK. There's absolute understanding that this is not one open world, and it is being negotiated right now, everywhere, for different sets of people.
So I want to ask you about how you see it now, but I was thinking, watching the film, about how you do get from there to here, from 1999 to 2026, and that thing that was glimpsed, these two worlds. And as you say, actually it's a false division, but for a long time it looked like it was an absolute division between what can be controlled and what is beyond control. And in that story, watching the film, I found myself thinking about an event that at the time was much parodied, including on South Park, the TV show, but is the real life version of this film. I don't know if people remember this. It goes under various names, but one of them is Nipplegate, which is in 2004 when Janet Jackson was performing at the Super Bowl with Justin Timberlake, wearing an elaborate leather costume. And notoriously, there was a wardrobe malfunction. That was the euphemism that entered the language. And on primetime network TV, crucially, people of all ages, because it's the Super Bowl, wholesome American entertainment in which men on drugs try to kill each other, people of all ages were able to see one of her two breasts, including a nipple. And it's 2004, and it's interesting reading about it now because the commentary on it now says that 2004, the summer of 2000, it would have been early in 2004, was when the Iraq War was starting to descend into the kind of thing that we saw on this film. And the amount of virtual and literal print that was expended on Janet Jackson's nipple relative to the amount that was expended on what people did or didn't know about the Iraq War was a kind of version of this movie. And then I didn't know this, and I don't know if it's true, you may know if it's true or not, But in the accounts of that now it says, and one of the consequences of Nipplegate was that a group of people thought, this is so absurd, we need to create an online platform where you are free from this kind of censorious bullshit. And the name for that platform was YouTube. And I don't know if it's true, it may be part of the myth of this story, but that, as it were, those two events coincided in just the way that this movie suggests. There's insane, hypocritical, censorious American political madness over here. So we need freedom over here. And the name for that freedom is the internet.
I think it is somewhat true.
Well, I'll take somewhat.
Take somewhat true. I think that it is a PR dream to say that you started YouTube because of Nipplegate, but I think there's a more complex history than that, which I don't know intimately. But I'm just not sure how unusual it is that we get the dead cat over here and the political outrage over there. And I often think this, in the current sort of endless storm of bad news that we have now, is I'm not sure we're hearing quite the right bad news. We're hearing a lot of bad news, but look how much it is about this person's appointment and this person's sacking, and how little it is about Sudan or something vastly more important. So I think it's in a grand tradition, and that is indeed what the film's talking about. And that's actually why I like the film. I think the film is an absolute shot over the bows about hypocrisy, about denial, about false values. It's got all those big things, but you are absolutely confronted with your own sort of right at the edge of your own taste, and feeling whether it's actually appropriate to laugh. But also what I love, and this is one of the reasons I just love the movies in general, is actually you can't actually stop yourself laughing. It's something you do. You respond. And so a lot of those moments are actually quite gotcha moments. And I think that's what's sophisticated about the film. That's why it's more than a silly movie and more than a filthy movie and more than trying to just shock for the sake of shocking and all of those things, that it actually forces you to the edge of your tolerance in a way, and accuses you of being intolerant at the same time. And it's just quite an interesting trick.
That thing that is familiar, the dead cat thing, I don't want to make this too much about Trump, but it is interesting that the version that we see there, the assumption is that what politicians will do, the version of the dead cat, will be they will express outrage at some cultural event to distract people's attention from the fact that over here they're killing people. So they'll take a hip hop album or a nipple on TV, and they will, George W. Bush, the people around him will use that to distract people from the fact that the really serious stuff is happening over here. The difference with Trump is the instigator of the dead cat. So if you remember, one of Trump's dead cat tactics in his debate with Kamala Harris was to talk about dead cats, which is in one of the debates where he sounded like a lunatic, and he said, they eat their cats. The Haitian immigrants eat their cats. And at the time, people said, as they have said many times about Trump, well, that's the end of him. I mean, this man is clearly unfit to be president. And for the next 2 months, the media talked about that dead cat gaffe, not strong enough for what it was. And during those 2 months, Harris's campaign stalled and then tanked because nobody was talking about the other stuff. So he is a genius at it. The open the fucking straight thing is a dead cat thing. But the difference is it is not political outrage of culture for the distraction. It is the politics of cultural outrage as the distraction. And that's when we're in a different world. And that's why Trump is different.
No, I think you're right. And it's funny because for another reason, I was actually looking at some of the things that Trump has said about freedom of speech in the UK, and particularly trying to undermine the trade deal by saying that people in Britain weren't free. So I was looking at it and he goes, it's so sad. So sad. I mean, I can't do a Trump. He looked like a cartoon of pity. And then he said, and I'm going to talk to Starmer. and I'll tell him. And then he, launched forward with his sort of, because we're not having it. And it was just an incredible thing. He says, people in Britain are not allowed to speak, and it was like every single part of it was a genius sort of diversion from absolutely everything very serious that was happening on the bag. But all the journalists were distracted by what did he mean by sad? What had he said back to Starmer?
Trying to imagine the conversation. Everyone's obsessed with wanting to know.
Does he really believe what he just... I mean, literally, it was like a sort of a flurry. And I thought, the man is a genius. The man is a genius. The speech is to get in the way of what's actually going on.
And then the other weird inversion of the story that we saw in the film, which is the assumption that Republican politicians, there was a Democrat president then, and Tipper Gore was the wife of the vice president, but still, I think the assumption is, broadly speaking, on the right, or the left that's inclining to the right, what they want to do is censor. They are the people who believe in censorship. And freedom of speech, which this film is ostensibly in favor of, is pushing back against that. Now we have a president for whom the distraction is to say they are the censors and we are the people who believe in free speech. They want to shut down the internet. They want to regulate what tech platforms can do, great American tech platforms. And we are the ones who believe that you should be free to say what you want to say. So again, the argument has almost turned on its head.
Unless you happen to be a late night host who has something to say about...
Unless you're on the mainstream media. So it's both of the... So the mainstream media arguments are still going on. They think that the networks and the New York Times are places where the most disgusting stuff has to be stopped from appearing. And at the same time, they want to say the thing about Britain is that we're not free here because we're not free to watch whatever we want on their platforms.
At this point, so many people are going into America with dummy phones because they might have one day said something. So many colleagues from American universities are going, help, is there work in Europe? We cannot speak on campus anymore. So I think it's now a bleed. The Kennedy Center, the cultural community, people cannot put things on that they think will challenge. So I think we're in a new world order in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of America.
I'm sure I'm not alone in this. I find arguments about freedom of speech head spinning because I can't sort of place where the arguments are anymore. In this film, it's a clear argument, it's a simple argument, it's a compelling argument. You could disagree with it. You could say that children are corrupted by this stuff, but it's clear what it's standing for. It is saying we are censoring the wrong things. Whereas now, I don't know what people are talking about when they talk about freedom of speech.
Listen, I'm not going to put a bunch of preschoolers in front of this, but it's really quite out there in many, many ways. But the message of it was absolutely appropriate for young people of a certain age. And I mean, I love the fact that he's at war with the MPPA, who rate the films, absolutely at war. They were almost as bad as any other opposition, and certainly worse than the devil, it turned out. But I think the thing is that as we've moved into a world where information is created and behavior is nudged and pushed and everything is paid for and it's rated and it's promoted, then speech, we don't really know what is speech and what is actually simply someone, a behavioral psychologist somewhere over there who's helped a commercial company find your attention to whatever it is that they want you to attend to. And that sort of complication has meant that, when someone says, as the American government recently did, that Europeans are being censored, so what they are going to do is set up a government portal to show all the material that is censored here, and you say, well, what is that? And it sort of ends up being child sexual abuse, it ends up being beheadings, it ends up being sort of extremist content that is trying to radicalize people, and so on and so on. You go, Well, I'm not sure that's any kind of freedom of speech that I was actually fighting for in the first place, or that is represented by this movie. You raise that in certain contexts, and what they say is, oh, we don't mean it. So that's the other thing about current speech. But I think that we have to really be quite concerned about a world in which mostly what you see is at the behest of someone, whether it's an idea or a commercial entity. We're not supposed to take seriously what people say. You know, our prime minister's always got someone else to blame, and their president always has
It's got something new to say tomorrow.
something new to say tomorrow. And then we've got this new spectre of AI, which has another set of whole issues about plausibility, averages, how you prompt, sycophancy. I use it every day for different reasons. But in terms of questions of speech, it's not a reliable speaker. And yet it is increasingly determining what is said. So I think head spinning is a great way of saying it. And I think that we really do need, on all sides of the argument, to be much more sophisticated about what we mean, or perhaps more detailed. What do we mean about freedom? What freedom are we seeking? What do we mean by speech? And what are we going to call all these other things that may actually be different versions of the same? And that's quite a lot for human beings to get their head round.
As you suggested, one of the ways in which the film, it's not dated, but it's just from another time, is that now all of these questions are bound up with addictive technologies. That's the thing that underpins so much of this, the economy of it, the politics of it. This is, as people say, the attention economy, and that's what we're trading in. And that's not true of that world. So the kids go and see the movie and they like it and they go and see it again. You know, I remember I went to see Grease 6 times. I don't think that means I was addicted to it. And you had to queue up to get in like they did as well. The classroom in this film, it's satirized, but the classroom is still a place in which bad language might come in, but the other stuff's not coming in. The classroom is still, you know, this is still an analog world in that respect. And now all of these arguments relate to a technology which primarily exists to keep us online. And that's not what, I mean, the glimpse of it as they click on the German website. But even then, the thought was, you know, they ran screaming out of the room. I mean, that's the other thing. Even those kids didn't want to see that. But it's a completely different set of arguments when the thing that we're fighting against is, including for children, crucially for children, is not being able to come offline, rather than the fact that these bad things might intrude in particular ways.
One of the things that I think just people need to think about is Wikipedia. There's the information, all the bad stuff in the world, 32 pages on bestiality. I have counted them. And yet it doesn't pull you in, doesn't keep you there, doesn't offer you then snuff movies. You know, it doesn't make it worse, doesn't hold your attention. And when you leave, it doesn't come and get you back. That is the good old internet. And I think that's what I see as freedom. The freedom to go in, if you're a kid, transgress, if you're an adult, go have a look, do what you like, come back. But I think for me, I'm increasingly trying to think about this conceptually, about freedom of thought rather than freedom of speech, because speech has got muddled up in all the ways that you've just described and ways I've described. And I think that if you are free to think, you know, if you have it's a sort of a freedom of action. I just think we have to really move this discussion away from speech and speech alone, because it's intersecting in a way where speech is created by machines as well as by humans. And it's engineered to push your behavior in certain ways. And so both the freedom and the speech are compromised somehow.
So you mentioned you had this slightly queasy moment where you worried, am I as a person campaigning for children, am I someone represented in this movie? Part of the target of the film is the hypocrisy of parents. There they are, censorious, more or less insane. And yet they're trying to stop their children from being exposed to things that are basically benign. The difference now, you hear the argument about hypocrisy again and parents all the time now. The difference is the hypocrisy that people say is not the parents are effing and jeffing in front of the kids. And it's none of that. It's the parents will not put down their phones, but they tell the kids they're not allowed to pick up their phones. And that they're never going to win that argument. But it's a different argument precisely because it is an argument about addiction. It's not an argument about freedom of speech or the hypocrisy of someone who might, parenting is hypocrisy anyway, say one thing and then tell their kids to do something else. And that again feels to me like one of the ways in which we're a long way from this film. So I think lots of parents feel hypocritical in this world. They're trying to protect their children from something, not that they're doing themselves, but that they know they can't protect themselves from because they have been sucked into it too.
I do a lot of work with children. I spend a lot of, I do a lot of workshops. For the last 15 years, I've done workshops about technology with children from all over the world. And the single biggest thing that they say in the more connected world is, I wish my parents would put their phone down. I mean, that is their single biggest issue. And sometimes it is heartbreaking that they tell stories about how their parents don't look them in the eye, that they never concentrate, they don't ask them. There was one girl who I remember years ago, and she gave me a number, and it was in the hundreds. It was not a small number. And I said, "What's that number?" And she said, "It's the number of times my mother's picked me up from school and she's been on the phone." It was just absolutely heartbreaking. In parts of the world that are less connected, the kids are really mainly worried about getting connected and affordability. So that's the fracture. But I do think there's something else, which is it's very frustrating because the one thing we haven't really talked about is the way information is personalized to you. And so obviously that's part of the addiction reason. It's part of the promotion thing that I was talking about. But the personalization, it's not actually to you. It's to all the tribes you're in. So if you're 13 and a boy, that means you'll be sent porn or introduced to strangers who are selling sex or whatever. If you are a 13-year-old girl, you are in a tribe or you're intersecting with a tribe that maybe are doing things like, self-harming, whatever. And you're in a number of tribes. You're not just in the one tribe. And it comes at you, but it's very defining. And I think that the other thing that kids say again and again about their parents is they have no idea what we're seeing, doing, being offered, because they're not in those tribes. They're in a completely different tribe. So I think that is something about, whether it's telly or film or whatever, radio, it was a more collective experience. It was an experience where you could decide as a group or as a parent with moral authority in your own home, this is the edge for us. And you go, when you grow up, you can do what you like, but in my house, this is how it goes. Well, in my house, you have no control anymore. And so I think that the absolute anxiety of parents is their own feelings of addiction and so on, but it's also the lack of understanding, the lack of shared meaning in the life that is going on in one household. And part of the fury of children and young people is, you bastards put this in our lives and you do not know what is going on. You have no idea. And the anger of the kids is quite palpable in a lot of the work I do, that they've been abandoned to worlds to which they are addicted, as you pointed out, that parents have taken no care of. Not parents individually as my parents, but the adult world has not really taken care of. And you just have to start looking at stats about how many kids have seen beheadings, how many kids have seen live killings, how many kids have seen child sexual abuse. It is absolutely extraordinary, and I think it's mind-boggling to most adults. And so, I do sound a bit like that woman now, but I think that we have to make this difference. It's shocking, and this is the world that the kids are living in that people don't quite see.
And in all those terms, that makes this movie, as you said, of course you should be nostalgic. It's quaint. That is a world in which the worst thing that could happen is that the Canadians might make us all listen to Bryan Adams.
I mean, that is tough.
It's not, I remember, you remember when that U2 album appeared on everyone's phones, and this was like the greatest. God, it would be nice to go back to that. Not to hear the album, but it would be nice to go back to that world.
I'm a first-time watcher, and I found it really interesting that it's scapegoating of Canadians, and there's something that felt quite prophetic for today. I'll be interested to hear what you made of that. Do you think that was something deliberate?
I think for a lot of people, the prophetic bit, not so much now, but a few months ago, was war with Canada.
Yeah.
And I assume that in 1999, what was funny about that was it was just a completely laughable idea. Let's pick the thing that's not going to happen and make fun of that. It's also ironic now that you genuinely will see people saying that Canada is the centre of the resistance because Mark Carney is the figurehead around whom he's going to have to be for us, the Kyle's mum in this story, going back the other way. I mean, war with Canada, I think, is still a laughable idea. I think for Trump, that was dead cat rather than the real thing. But still, there is something weird about seeing a film from 1999 the other thing about it is that the way it satirizes war is the only way it knows how to satirize war, which is through old war movies. So it's about like The Draft and Winona Ryder coming to entertain the troops and all of that.
Yeah.
The motifs of the Second World War, the resistance, and Vietnam. If you did a movie satirizing war now, you wouldn't be able to do it that way.
That wasn't the first time that I'd seen the movie, because I'm old enough to remember when it first came out. It's important to remember that the whole thing is a satire of South Park, of course, because Terrence and Phillip are South Park. And I'm old enough to remember the sheer hysteria, the moral panic. When I was at primary school, the panic about the corruption was real. And of course, looking back, that seems so ridiculous, not least because of what came after. But in some ways, I think the panic was misplaced, but shouldn't have been ignored. And there's a case for saying that South Park is in some ways the most significant cultural artifact of the West in the 21st century, which sounds preposterous, but hear me out. Because what it did was break down the barriers against that kind of absolute crudity of humour, sending up everybody left, right and centre, taking no prisoners. But what's paradoxical about this is that Matt Parker and Stone, the creators, are themselves extremely intelligent and actually very astute political commentators. And I've been watching South Park for 28 years because that's how many seasons there are. And the latest South Park is devastating in its assault on the Trump administration. They are the bastions of free speech in America. The message is very clearly these guys are a disgrace to the Republic. But the problem with South Park in a way is that you always needed to read it at two levels. You always needed to see that, yes, it was crude and silly and utterly unhinged in some ways and very funny, but it was also intelligent. The problem is that a lot of the people who enjoyed South Park from kind of 1999 onwards are also the same people watching WWE, who are watching that period of wrestling when Donald Trump is getting a lot of attention, who are watching The Apprentice. And that shift in American culture paved the way to the MAGA movement. And so South Park sits at this very odd place in American history, that it's not an enablement of, at least it's not a deliberate enabling of the MAGA movement. It's not Trumpist. In fact, if anything, they're enormous critics of Trump now, today. They're some of the most ferocious critics. And yet what they did was they enabled a zeitgeist or a cultural milieu, whatever pretentious term you want to use for it, which allowed Trump to come through. And the fact that they are now portraying Trump as Saddam Hussein in exactly the same with the face, the body, the relationship with Satan. It's funny, but it's also ironic because they helped pave the way for Americans' version of their depiction of Saddam Hussein.
But do you think that they paved the way or they saw it coming?
I think they paved the way. I don't think they saw it coming. Part of the safety of making that in 1999 was 9/11 hadn't happened yet. America was still, things were okay. It's only 10 years since the Berlin Wall's fallen, and much further away from that world now than they were from communism being the opposite.
I agree. I think they thought that they were satirizing culture, and one of the ways to satirize culture was through this version of politics. They did not think that they were foreseeing that version of politics would come to pass, I think. That's my guess.
No, and in fact, Trey Parker, I think he said that he could no longer, he's going to stop Trump because there's no satire left, because real life is beyond satire. So he sort of threw the towel in, as it were. So I think that speaks to your point. But I'm really interested in the idea that you think it was that critical as a cultural artifact that it could have made this amount of change. You may be right, but I think it's quite a big thought.
And I'll just say one more thing about it. The other thing for which they are well known, probably now better known, is the Book of Mormon. And the thing about the Book of Mormon is this is a dry run for the Book of Mormon, the sort of satirizing of musical theatre, complete foul-mouthed language of a kind you never heard before coming out of the mouths of innocents. It's that thing. But the thing about the Book of Mormon is that it is affectionate. It's actually, as a cultural product, I think you can tell that these people's heart is in the right place. This is savage. I mean, there's nothing, I didn't think there was anything affectionate there. And so if you want to just see and revel in the savagery, it does give you that license. I think with the Book of Mormon, you can't revel in the savagery because at the end of it, you just feel warmly about everything, including Mormons, but not in this.
I was also a first-time watcher. I was 2 when the movie came out, so I have no recollection of life in the 90s. Apologies to all. I was going to ask about the portrayal of women in the movie, references to abortion, heaven being naked women, and then obviously women being the ones that get involved with kids and starting that argument and how we think that is relevant in the world of today.
It's funny because I was thinking about that too as I was watching it this evening, and I was wondering how it would be different now if it tried to do the same thing. And I don't mean tried to tackle all the issues that we've discussed about now, but how it would portray women. And I think it probably would be more careful. And I think it would probably have some other elements to balance it out. That's what I honestly think. What I also think, and that moment where he talks about my mother attacking me with a coat hanger in the womb, I just thought that was so courageous in the context of America. And I think that's why I forgive a lot of the things I find offensive, not just around gender, frankly, but around lots of different things in the movie, because it does seem to treat everything equally to get you to a place where you can actually critique things that you couldn't critique if you took it all incredibly seriously and earnestly. So I also have to say I celebrate the size of the clitoris on the screen. That was fantastic. Think how many young men have watched that and they may actually go away and look and try and find it. I just think on the whole, before I did what I do now, I was a movie director. And one of the things I always felt was that you always got reviewed for the movie they wished you'd made instead of the one you'd made. So I think I'm speaking from that spirit. Yeah, you're not wrong. But actually, there's a lot to love as a woman in that movie. And I think that I meet this movie where it is, and it's in a really, really bizarre place. But I kind of love it for its courage.
And I think the only thing I would say, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, I mean, it is schoolboy humour. That's the point of it. That's who they are, and that's what this is. And for that reason, the things that it is mocking, it is also in some ways enabling. I mean, that's the danger with schoolboy humour, I'm afraid. I mean, schoolboy humour just is that. But it's still quaint. So again, one of the things I think it's satirising is the Peanuts cartoons and Charlie Brown and the red-headed girl, and it's very funny, the kind of 4.0 GPA kid and the girl whose clitoris he's trying to find. My God, it's quaint, seen from 2026. So that's schoolboy humour, 1999 style. Yeah. It's not perfect.
When you said there was nothing to love in it, and I thought, you didn't like the love story then, where he pukes up every time he sees the person he loves. I find that very touching.
Regular listeners to this podcast might have recognised the voice of one of our questioners there. That was Paul Sagar, who quite recently was our guide to political philosophy and philosophical realism. And we discovered in that question and afterwards that Paul is something of a scholar of South Park. He has seen, he thinks, maybe all of the episodes. And as I chatted to him afterwards, it turns out he's got quite a lot to say. So we caught up with him for a little extra in this episode. This is me talking to Paul Sagar about his grand theory of South Park, American culture, and American politics. Paul, I just wanted to ask you to say a bit more about the idea that South Park, as well as satirizing and criticizing the world that created Donald Trump, also enabled it, and that it was part of a late 20th, early 21st century culture, pop culture, that laid the grounds for Trump and Trumpism. What else was in that culture? So South Park is part of that universe. What else is in it, do you think?
I think the big three are going to be South Park, WWE Wrestling, and The Apprentice. Specifically, The Apprentice because of enabling Donald Trump, but not just the fact that it enabled him personally to get famous, avoid bankruptcy, become a household name, be perceived by ordinary Americans as a successful businessman, which, of course, he may not indeed be such a thing, but The Apprentice enabled him to present himself that way. But it's not just that. It's also The Apprentice's kind of glitzy, you're fired, one man who comes in, makes decisions, the leader, you just got to pick the talent and be brutal, and that solves the problems. That created a mythos in American culture of, Washington is a swamp where nothing works. We need to treat it like a businessman coming in on The Apprentice, finding the talent and sorting it out. So that enabled Trump specifically, but also a reorientation to what American government could and couldn't do. The other one, WWE Wrestling, I think the best thing for people to do here is watch the documentary on Netflix about Vince McMahon, the owner of WWE. It's an incredible documentary. It makes you understand how something like Trump and MAGA is possible. Trump does come into the documentary in the final episode, but he could actually be absent entirely and you would still understand because of the spectacle, this idea of kayfabe, the American or this carnival term for, you're always in character. The crowd is in on the joke. Everybody knows it's scripted and not real, but you root for either a heel or a baby face. And the thing is that many people like to root for the heel, the baddie. And Trump, of course, is a heel. He's not a babyface. And what a lot of what I've just said there, if you've never watched this documentary or never watched WWE, it's going to sound absolutely bizarre. What is he talking about? Well, go watch the documentary and you'll go, oh, this is how they could get to a point of thinking that someone like Trump is possible. And the third one for me is South Park. The third of the big three is South Park. And South Park is in some ways for me the most interesting. South Park is sophisticated in a way that a lot of its critics never gave it credit for and still don't realize. And it's in a very paradoxical relationship to MAGA, to Trump, to the American experiment in politics and culture and society as it is now. So it's those three together, but I think South Park is the most interesting.
So what is fascinating about that is that I completely get, so I'm not that familiar with the wrestling stuff. The Apprentice, Trump's Apprentice, I saw bits of it, much more familiar with the Alan Sugar version, which is, it's almost like a parody of the thing itself. And South Park, I fully understand how they're related. And yet they stand in such a different relationship to the thing that we're describing, in the sense that South Park is satirizing it. The wrestling, it's an in-joke version of it. And then with The Apprentice, I imagine the producers on The Apprentice were trying, in part, to send up the thing that they were creating. But I don't think the man at the heart of it was trying to send up the thing that he was creating. It was his vehicle. So one of them is the Trump vehicle. One of them is a kind of template for a way in which you can be both in on the joke and not in on the joke. And the other one is the joke. And yet together, somehow, they feel like they're part of a similar way of imagining America.
So South Park is a program which needs to be understood, if you're going to understand it fully, on two levels. On one level, it's toilet humor, right? It's very, very silly. It's deliberately crass. It is pushing the envelope as far as possible. And it's part of an American free speech culture. In some ways, if you want to be pretentious about it, Tocqueville, remarks about one thing Americans love is that they can spit on their own leaders. That in other countries, their leaders spit on them. But in America, we spit on our leaders, right? There's something deeply American about it and deeply puerile and absolutely gleeful in its willingness to shock and offend people. And it always has been. And of course, the other thing about South Park is when they want to, they can be unbelievably vicious and nasty when they think the person on the receiving end of it deserves it. And in some ways, it's been incredibly influential because when South Park first came out, they were way on the outer limits of what anybody could see and do on mainstream TV at that point. And it did cause moral panics. And now they're almost tame by comparison to the things we see on the internet and the extent to which the Overton window has shifted to allow things like that. So that's one aspect of South Park, which is just the sheer crudity of it. But the thing that people often missed with South Park, especially in the early days, and still to this day, is it was never just crude. South Park was also very, very intelligent if you were willing to read it at both levels. Trey Parker and Matt Stone could see that excessive liberal pieties were going to go in the opposite direction and become a mirror image of the things they were opposing. Trey Parker and Matt Stone could see this coming, and they laughed at it then. The problem for South Park is that because they were so over the top. There's two ways to read this. But if you just watch South Park and think it's fart jokes and being nasty, and you miss this other part, that this has a payoff in terms of a critique of the social issues that we're facing, then what you only get from South Park is permission to be nasty to your enemies, thinking that the crudeness is the point, that the cruelty is the point. And the tragedy, in a way, the irony of South Park is that that was never what South Park was about. South Park was always, it was two libertarians, socially libertarian, who don't believe in any form of censorship and are very, very intelligent social critics. But I don't think they realised or appreciated, or maybe it's not their fault. They didn't realise that maybe more than half of their audience was only laughing at the crudeness. They weren't laughing at the satire of unthought out moral pieties. And if we go back to the movie that we watched at the cinema, what I think a lot of people never realize is the Terrence and Phillip characters, they are South Park. So in the movie, the mothers are up in arms because Terrence and Phillip, they just fart on each other, and that's corrupting the youth. It's warping their fragile little minds, as Cartman says. And the irony, of course, is Cartman's evil and corrupt psychopath already. Terrence and Phillip isn't corrupting Cartman. Cartman's already like that, right? But you can blame Terrence and Phillip. And Terrence and Phillip is just fart jokes. But what South Park is laughing about is that South Park isn't just fart jokes, as proved by this movie satirizing the moral panic about South Park. So you get some people who just watch it for fart jokes and think that's the point, the cruelty is the point. You get people who are too pious, too liberal in the American sense, who get offended by it, and they miss the intelligent critique. Unfortunately, I think that because they were part of things like the raunch culture in the early 2000s, lad culture, WWE when it's going through its most extreme phases, that set in place the woke liberal backlash against that. The people who rejected the woke liberal backlash went full on to the South Park, their misreading of South Park, that the cruelty is the point, the crudeness is the point. And then what you get is the MAGA backlash to the woke movement. And so in some ways, South Park both enabled and predicted and tracked this very important cultural shift in America, which explain to some extent where we are today. I don't think they caused it simply. I don't think they simply made it happen. In some ways, they're barometers, but they are in the mix of being a factor that's causal as well. It's a very complicated phenomenon, but South Park really is interesting. And because it's been around since the early 90s, it's been, I think, 30 years now. I remember watching it as a child and then rediscovering it in my early 20s as, hang on a minute, I didn't understand what I was watching as a child. This is so much smarter than I thought. And I think I've watched every South Park episode now. I know I'm 39 now. It's been a part of my life, my whole life. And I've watched it both track and reflect and to some extent bring about the very world that we're living in now. But I think if you told them in 1999, this will be the plot of the reality, not South Park in 25 years, they wouldn't have thought it can't actually get that bad. But we're saying it might, but we don't really think it will. But then it did get that bad. So that's my grand theory of South Park.
I have one question about that theory. I think I'm convinced by it. It's also, to use a very English phrase, part of the problem is it's just too clever by half. And I found myself in the film watching it. So, for instance, in the movie, in the classroom, there is a picture on the wall of Thurgood Marshall, the great 1960s civil rights Supreme Court justice, the first black Supreme Court justice. And that could mean a lot of different things, but in a way, it's too much, right? It's asking too much of the viewers to know how to take that in the background, whatever it's meant to symbolize, alongside what you're seeing in the foreground. So there is a sense relative to WWE, which is not too clever by half. It's just much cleverer than you think it is. And The Apprentice, which is not too clever by half and actually isn't cleverer than you think it is. It's just very good at what it does. But the other thought that I have is, you touched on it, which is this feels both like a very 21st century story, that American culture, because it has that libertarian strand in it, and American democracy has in it that openness to utter contempt, which I've often been struck by. And people who study past American elections are often shocked by just how crude and vicious and foul-mouthed the invective is at the level of democratic argument. Many American presidential elections, if you dig a bit beneath the surface, have under them this kind of cesspit of abuse, going back famously to Adams against Jefferson at the start of the 19th century. That was a South Park election, weirdly. And so it also feels like this isn't just a 21st century story, it is an American story, that in a way the culture that allows people to be incredibly cruel in the name of democratic freedom is also the culture that, through its democracy, sometimes empowers extremely cruel politicians. I imagine there's a McCarthyism version of this. I'm going to be talking to Helen Lewis about Good Night and Good Luck, George Clooney's much softer take, but critique of McCarthyism. But it seems to me it's at least possible that your ground theory of South Park is also a ground theory of 200 plus years of American democracy, if democracy is what it is.
The only country in the world, and probably in human history, that could have produced South Park is America. And it's no accident that South Park is where America came from. And the fact that it's set in Colorado, in a small nowhere town, but yet in Colorado you have the Jewish family, you have the obese child who's a single mother, you have, every town is what South Park is supposed to stand in for. But it is deeply American, and it could only have come from America. And of course, what's interesting here is to think another way that I think it's such a significant cultural touchstone is it also speaks to the enormous influence of American culture abroad. What was dominating the discussion when I was at primary school for a few months at least? South Park, the moral panic of, in some ways, it shouldn't have been a moral panic in the UK because we don't have our strange interlinked Christian evangelical culture here. We don't have a prurient moralism. As you mentioned in the Q&A, Tipper Gore, only a few years before that movie is coming out, the Americans are getting upset that there might be swearing in rap lyrics and they have to put stickers on them to protect the youth. Won't somebody think of the children? Which, of course, The Simpsons is another important aspect here. The cultural dominance of America was so widespread that we had a moral panic in this country about their moral concerns, their culture, and they were so pervasive for so long. And yes, so a much smaller player in the long run here would be The Simpsons. And The Simpsons, in particular, satirizing, they have an episode where they go to the future and Lisa has just become president. And they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, there's no money left here because President Trump has ruined the national finances." And back then it was like, the joke seemed to be, ha ha ha, that's so absurd, it could never happen. They didn't predict it as such, but they could sort of intuit, writers like the early Simpsons, writers like Trey Parker and Matt Stone, they could intuit that if we carry on the way we are, these things can become reality, and that's why it's funny to satirize them now. It's not that they're completely impossible. It's the very fact that if we're not careful, we are going to end up there. And it turns out that they were right. They were right to satirize it, but it was funnier then than it is now.
It's also the case, I think, that in the long history of American democracy, and Tocqueville is ambivalent on this question, but I think he also possibly believes that it has a self-correcting mechanism. It pushes things quite far and then they get pulled back. And Tocqueville's fear is that this would end up not in farce and absurdity, but in a kind of soft tyranny. What America has now is not a soft tyranny. What America has now is a political culture of cruelty. I mean, the distinguishing characteristic to me of the Trump White House is its cruelty. It's astonishing cruelty. And I think for a long time there was a belief that it does move back and forth in a way. The thing that allows vicious political invective against leaders also enables vicious leaders, but that democracy has a way of correcting itself. And that maybe the difference with the Trump version of this is there is now a suspicion that it doesn't correct itself. I mean, a lot of people believe it still does, and that the Trump era will pass and this thing will be pulled back into a space where the norms of American democratic culture are not simply the norms of South Park and the things that South Park was satirizing. But I suspect there are increasing numbers of people who have lost that faith, and that might be the difference in this story. After all, McCarthyism, in the end, destroyed itself. And Trumpism will destroy itself, but I think there is now a fear that in the destruction, it will also destroy the norms of American political culture.
I think that's right. And I think that South Park is a paradox in this respect because South Park is not cruel. And you said this in the discussion about their other very famous product, the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is not cruel towards Mormonism. And indeed, there's a precursor episode of South Park where it looks like they're taking the mickey out of Mormonism, but the payoff at the end is no, it's the people mocking the Mormons who are actually the cruel ones and need to look at themselves in the mirror. South Park is not cruel. It never has been. When I was at school, we all thought that the joke about stand having a gay dog was that the dog was gay. And then we didn't realize, no, that the joke was on us for being homophobic, that the message of that episode is precisely that it's okay to be gay. And they won awards for that, right? And this is, before gay marriage is legalized in America, this is when there's still intense homophobia in Hollywood movies, in TV, in music. South Park were way ahead of the curve and being like, this is ridiculous. Homophobia is stupid and we're going to laugh at it. South Park was never cruel. But the great irony is that they may have enabled, not just them, not unicausally, but they may have helped enable precisely the kinds of cruelty that Stone and Parker themselves have long been, in fact, opposed to. And that's why it's such a strange artifact and a strange moment in our history. But like you say, I am very skeptical that we can go back. The idea that, Trump's an aberration and we'll go back to being nice to each other and having norms of decency. I don't know what comes next, but history rarely reverts to what it was previously. And I would be very, very surprised. After 10 years of Trump dominating everything in terms of the news cycle, the culture wars, the obsession with both his enemies and his loyalists, who knows what comes next, but we're not going back to 1998.
There are 3 more films in our season at the Regent Street Cinema coming up. If you would like to come to any of them, just go to the events page on our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in the show description and you will get all the details. Next time, it's a 2-part conversation as part of our regular series with the historian Robert Saunders, in which we reflect on significant historical anniversaries. It is about to be the 100th anniversary of the United Kingdom's one and only general strike in 1926. So we are going to be talking about the general strike, what it meant then, and what it has meant since. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.